What is an ecosystem? Introduction. What do a tide pool on the coast of California and the Amazon rainforest of South America have in common? Despite being many orders of magnitude different in size, both are examples of ecosystems, communities of organisms living together in combination with their physical environment. So as you guys can see here, in the pictures, you have a tide pool off the coast of California. And as you can see in the tide pool, you've got a lot of different species in there. If you look close, think about some of the biotic and abiotic factors in that picture. And then you can move to the picture on the right, which is a picture of the Amazon rainforest and also the Amazon River. And think about also there's not biotic factors, a lot of biotic factors in the picture, but again, think of some biotic and abiotic factors that could be in that picture. So those are both examples of ecosystems, which are a community of organisms living together within their environment. That's what an ecosystem is. As a reminder, a community consists of all the populations of all the species that live together in a particular area. So if we're talking about a community, we're talking about the populations of species. The concept of ecosystem and community are closely related. The difference is that an ecosystem includes the physical environment, while a community does not. So the physical environment, meaning what does the environment look like around that organism? So are there trees? Is it water? Are there rocks? Is it sand? All those different features come into play with the physical environment. You can also bring into account weather. What does the weather look like? What does the climate look like? So all those things are going to make up the physical environment. Whereas in the community, when we're talking about a community, all those things really don't play into that. It's strictly looking at populations of species. So how many squirrels are there in this community? How many trees are there in this community? How much algae is in this community? So you're looking at populations in a community, whereas in an ecosystem, you're kind of looking at everything as a whole, everything that's surrounding the organisms. In other words, a community is the biotic or the living component of an ecosystem. In addition to this biotic component, the ecosystem also includes an abiotic component, the physical environment. Okay, so community is just looking at populations. It's looking at living things. It's not counting the amount of rocks in a certain area. It's counting the amount of living things. Whereas we talk about a ecosystem, we're looking at both biotic living things and then abiotic things, which are non-living things: water, sunlight, soil, rocks. Ecosystems can be small, such as the tide pools found near the rocky shores of many oceans, or very large, such as the Amazon rainforest in South America. It's basically up to the ecologist studying the ecosystem to define its boundaries in a way that makes sense for their questions of interest. So when we're looking at ecosystems, we can take a look at ecosystems on a granular scale, so a really, really small scale. As it could be a petri dish filled with bacteria. It could be maybe a fish tank at your house where you're having a couple different types of fish living with one another. Maybe you have some plants in there. You can look at ecosystems as a grand scale too, taking a look at a Sahara Desert or the Amazon rainforest. So you can really change the scope of the area you're looking at or the ecosystem you're looking at, depending on what you want to know. So if you're studying smaller organisms or you want to focus in on certain organisms, you're probably going to look at a smaller ecosystem. Whereas if you're studying how everything's interacting with one another, you're probably going to take a look at a larger ecosystem. What are ecosystems like? The short answer, they're incredibly diverse, which means that they have a lot of different biotic and abiotic factors. It's not one or two things. It's a whole spectrum of different animals and abiotic factors interacting with one another. Some ecosystems are marine, others are freshwater, and others yet terrestrial, land-based. Ocean ecosystems are most common on Earth. As oceans, the living organisms, they contain over 75% of the Earth's surface. Freshwater ecosystems are the rarest, covering only 1.8% of the Earth's surface. Terrestrial land ecosystems cover the remainder of the Earth. Terrestrial ecosystems, so terrestrial, when I hear that word, I'm thinking, like outer space. Terrestrial, I think of aliens, but that's not the case. Terrestrial means living on land. It's talking about the land, okay? Terrestrial ecosystems can be further grouped into categories called biomes, largely based on the climate. Examples of terrestrial biomes include tropical rainforests, savannas, deserts, coniferous forests, deciduous forests, and tundra. The map below shows the broad distribution of biomes on Earth. So take a look at your map, the picture of the map. You can see all those different colors on there, the greens, the gray, orange, kind of pinkish salmon colored, yellowish, blue, and then you guys can cross-reference those colors to the key down below. So you can see the green is the tropical rainforest. So take a look at your map and kind of identify the places where there is a tropical forest biome. I see some in the middle of Africa, up in the northern part of South America, down by Southeast Asia, and then think about where can you find a savanna or a tundra or a desert, okay? So think about all those things as you're looking at the map. Take a look at where Illinois would be. What type of biome do we live in? I see that as a temperate forest. And then you can see up in the north where the darker orange is, that is all tundra up there. And then eventually that bleeds into the polar ice. Even within a biome, there can be great diversity. For example, both the Sonoran Desert on the left and the interior of the island of Boa Vista on the right can be classified as deserts, but they have very different ecological communities. Many more species of plants and animals live in the Sonoran Desert. So just by looking at the pictures, you can clearly see the differences among these two deserts. The Sonoran Desert on the left shows more mountains. It shows more greenery. Maybe you have a lot of different types of plant species there. It's more hilly, more mountainous. And then on the right, where you have the Boa Vista, the island of Boa Vista, you can see that it's completely flat. Lots of rocks, not a lot of greenery. So those are both examples of deserts. However, in deserts, there could be different types of animals and abiotic factors interacting with one another. It's not going to be the same for all desert biomes or desert ecosystems. Each can be laid out differently. There can be different species of animals and plants, but they are not technically going to be the same in the sense that they're housing those same animal and plant species, and even with the abiotic factors. Energy and matter in ecosystems. Ecosystem ecologists are often most interested in tracing the movement of energy and matter through ecosystems. So energy, think about that. How does energy move throughout an ecosystem? Does it just come from the sun? Is it just the sun moving? Think about that. How does energy move? We'll take a closer look at the movement of energy and matter when we consider food webs, networks of organisms that feed on one another, and biochemical cycles, the pathways taken by chemical elements as they move through the biosphere. The organisms found in an ecosystem tend to have adaptations, beneficial features arising by natural selection that help them get energy and matter in the context of a particular ecosystem. So we're going to talk about food webs. Okay, food webs is a way that energy is traveling through an ecosystem. When you have a plant getting its energy from the sun, and then bugs eating the plants, or small animals eating the plants, and then in turn you have larger animals eating the smaller animals. That energy is moving around from animal to animal and from plant to plant. Okay. Also in ecosystems and biomes, you have animals that have specific adaptations so they can survive successfully. So an example that I love to use the most is if you think of the Arctic animals. What adaptations have they made so they could survive and hunt, eat and live easier in their environment? If you take a look at an Arctic fox or an Arctic hare or a polar bear, an Arctic owl, all those animals have a white and gray coloring, which helps them blend into the environment. Before we go into details, let's look at the key features of how energy and matter travel through ecosystems. Both energy and matter are conserved, neither created nor destroyed, but take different routes through ecosystems. So matter is recycled. The same atoms are reused over and over. Energy flows through the ecosystem, usually entering as light and exiting as heat. And we're going to talk about how that works. So matter is recycled. Matter is recycled through Earth's ecosystem. Though it may move from one ecosystem to another, as it does when nutrients are washed away into a river, the same atoms are used over and over again, assembled in different chemical forms and incorporated into the bodies of different organisms. As an example, let's see how chemical nutrients move through a terrestrial ecosystem. A land plant takes in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and other nutrients, such as nitrogen and phosphorus, from the soil to build the molecules that make up its cells. So if you take a look at the plant is using carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. From the soil, it's getting nitrogen and phosphorus to help build its cells and build the plant as a whole. And then you have the animal that's eating the plant. It uses the plant's molecules for energy for its own cells, but often rearranging atoms and molecules into new forms. When plants and animals carry out cellular respiration, break down molecules as fuel, carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. Okay, so as we breathe or break down molecules, animals are releasing carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere. Similarly, when they excrete waste or they die, their chemical compounds are used for energy and building material by bacteria and fungi. These decomposers release simple molecules back into the soil and the atmosphere, where they can be taken up anew in the next round of the cycle. So if you guys take a look at that picture provided for you, it just goes to show the cycle that's always occurring within these biotic factors in a ecosystem or a biome. You have all this energy, all these atoms that are constantly moving from one animal in one plant to another. So you have, it starts with the plants that are receiving CO2, so carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They're receiving energy from the sunlight, and in return they're receiving phosphorus and nitrogen from that soil. Okay, then the herbivores, you see that cute little bunny and the squirrel over there, they are eating that plant, right? And they are giving off CO2. Mr. Fox comes along and he eats that bunny and that squirrel, and then he has gotten energy from those animals, but he's giving off CO2. Mr. Fox, sad but true, these animals are going to eventually die, and what happens is then the decomposers take over and return all those nutrients from those animals and all that energy back into the soil. And who picks up that energy from the soil? You have the plants in return choosing or picking up that energy. So it's constantly moving. Atoms, energy are constantly moving throughout an ecosystem. Energy is unidirectional or one way. Energy, unlike matter, cannot be recycled in ecosystems. Instead, energy flows through an ecosystem is a one-way street, generally from light to heat. Energy usually enters ecosystems as sunlight and is captured in chemical form by our plants using photosynthesis. The energy is then passed through the ecosystem, changing forms as organisms metabolize, produce waste, eat one another, and eventually die and decompose. Each time energy changes form, some of it's converted to heat. Energy still counts as energy, and thus no energy has been destroyed, but it generally can't be used as energy source by living organisms. Ultimately, energy that entered the ecosystem as sunlight is dissipated as heat and radiated back into space. Okay, so what we talked about is we have those atoms, that matter, that are being recycled over and over and over again. And then we have energy, and you can see on your picture there, it explains how that flows in as sunlight, okay? And then whatever organism picks it up, that organism would give off heat, okay, giving off their own energy. So that cannot be recycled. Taking an energy, we cannot recycle that over and over again. That just comes in, it's used, and then we give off the remnants of that as heat. Stability and dynamics of an ecosystem. Ecosystems are dynamic. That means they're constantly moving, they're constantly changing. There's changes taking place all the time. If a ecosystem were to just be stagnant or static, it would be dead. It would not thrive. So a changing and dynamic ecosystem means it's healthy. As we discussed above, energy is constantly flowing through an ecosystem, and chemical nutrients are continually being recycled. At higher levels of organization, organisms are dying and being born, populations are fluctuating in their numbers, and climate patterns are varying seasonally and in less predictable ways. Equilibrium and disturbance. Equilibrium is the steady state of an ecosystem in when its composition and identity remain generally constant despite fluctuations in physical conditions and makeup of the biotic community. Ecosystems may be knocked out of the equilibrium by disruptive events that affect their composition. So equilibrium. What that means is that is the normal state of an ecosystem. If you think about the human body, our equilibrium would be our natural, normal, everyday state. Okay? What happens that would knock us out of our equilibrium is if we were to get sick. Okay? So getting sick, we would have a fever, we'd feel ill, we'd be tired, lethargic. So that would knock us off our equilibrium, and then it would perhaps take us a little bit to fight that illness or fight that virus in our body, so we could get back to that equilibrium state where it's our normal state. Okay. Some disturbances are a result of natural processes. For example, fire is a disturbance that can be caused by lightning in a prairie or a forest ecosystem. Other disturbances are the results of human activities. Okay, acid rainfall, deforestation. So if there's a natural disturbance taking place in an equilibrium, that's pretty natural. That's okay. But disturbances are going to affect that ecosystem, whether it's natural or whether it's caused by humans, okay? Disturbances that are caused results of humans are deforestation and dumping chemicals into the water. So algae is blooming at a crazy rate. Introducing invasive species. We talked about that Asian carp population has completely taken over the Illinois River. So let's take a look at how ecosystems deal with that and then kind of bounce back, how those things affect ecosystems. Different ecosystems may respond differently to the same disturbance. So I could perhaps have a tornado go through a forest area, and then I have a tornado go through a grassland. Okay, so that would be the same disturbance, but in two different ecosystems. So those ecosystems, depending on where those disturbances occur and what ecosystem is getting disturbed, that means that some ecosystems can recover quicker than others, while other may take more time to recover or perhaps not at all. Resistance and resilience. Ecologists use two parameters to measure how an ecosystem responds to disturbance. They use resistance and resilience. The ability of an ecosystem to remain at an equilibrium in spite of disturbances is called resistance. So if I were to dump chemicals into a pond or a lake, and that ecosystem is not really changing at all, that would be called resistance. Okay, it's resisting that disturbance. How readily an ecosystem returns to an equilibrium after being disturbed is called its resilience. So if I were to dump chemicals into that same pond or lake and there is we see kind of a fluctuation or a change in certain biotic factors or living things in that ecosystem, the time it takes to kind of rebound would be its resilience. So the time it takes to get back to that equilibrium state. Many ecologists think that biodiversity of an ecosystem plays a key role in stability. For example, if there were just one plant species with a particular role in an ecosystem, a disturbance that harms that one species, say a drought for a drought-sensitive species, might have a severe impact on an ecosystem as a whole. In contrast, if there were several plant species with similar functional roles, there would be a better chance that one of them being drought tolerant and helping an ecosystem survive. Okay, so this means that ecosystems with a higher amount of species in it, biotic factors, have a higher chance of bouncing back or not really being as affected or more resilient towards a disturbance rather than a less diverse ecosystem. So if I had an ecosystem with one kind of plant, like our article used for an example, and there was a fire and that plant happened to be an extremely flammable plant, that those plants would be burned and they would be gone, which would completely destroy the ecosystem or the majority of part of it. Whereas if I had a forest with 8 or 9 different kinds of trees, only one of which were flammable, that one flammable tree would most likely get wiped out, but I would have I would be left with still a great variety of trees, that can also be utilized in that ecosystem for living for animals or whatever. Ecosystem resistance and resilience are important when we consider the effects of disturbances caused by human activity. If a disturbance is severe enough, it may change an ecosystem beyond the point of recovery, push an ecosystem into a zone where it's no longer resilient. A disturbance of this sort could lead to permanent alteration or loss of an ecosystem.